Just 9 days before death would take him from this mortal world, the prophet and sixth president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph F. Smith, gathered his family together in the parlor of the Beehive House.
Everyone ready?
He spoke of his life, from the struggles of youth to the earned wisdom of his lengthening years as a dedicated disciple of Christ.
To have the privilege of meeting with my children on the anniversary of my presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I feel very grateful that under the circumstances, everything is so favorable as it is.
One thing I would like to share.
I want to say to my children that my body isn't what I would like it to be. But if you look right down into my heart, you'd find that my head and my heart are just as good as they ever were, and just as firm and faithful as they ever were in the world. If there is anything on earth I have tried to do as much as anything else, it is to keep my word, my promises, my integrity, to do what it was my duty to do.
Certainly, an innate sense of duty was thematic in the life of Joseph F. Smith. It was his keen ability to balance his many duties to family, faith, community, and church, by which many measured his greatness as a man and prophet. Speaking to members around the world, President Smith encouraged all to join him in doing, and doing well, their duty. In very fact, his first address as president of the church in 1901 emphasized this worthy ideal.
It is our duty to take hold of the work vigorously, with full determination and purpose of heart, to carry it on with the help of the Lord and in accordance with the inspiration of His Spirit, as it has been done in the past.
President Smith's clear sense of duty grew in part out of a humble yet noble ancestry.
Joseph F. Smith. His very name gives reference to the two great families from which he was born. The F standing for Fielding, which recalls his dear maternal roots, and Smith being the obvious paternal line. Joseph F.'s father, Hiram, was the sixth-generation Smith to farm the fertile lands of New England.
Born in the first year of the 19th century, Hiram Smith was the second oldest of 10 children born to Joseph and Lucy Mack Smith. While much of his life was spent in the shadow of his brother, Joseph Jr., Hiram was an important and dedicated advocate of his younger sibling and the great work which he ushered in. Joseph loved and respected no person more than his brother.
I pray in my heart that all my brethren were like unto my beloved brother Hiram, who possesses the mildness of a lamb and the integrity of a Job, and in short, the meekness and humility of Christ. And I love him with that love that is stronger than death.
Even though 6 years older, Hiram really was a counselor to Joseph Smith. From the very beginning of the Restoration, coming forth of the Book of Mormon, to the organization of the Church of Christ in Fayette in April of 1830, on through the New York period and the move to Ohio, the building of the Kirtland Temple, the Missouri period, and the Nauvoo period, Hiram was a counselor and a supporter. And it's this legacy of support that Joseph F. Smith grows up under in Nauvoo.
In the spring of 1831, Hiram and his wife Jerusha, along with their two young daughters, fled the troubles of New York. Following Joseph and the body of the saints, they settled in Kirtland, Ohio.
In another part of the world, Mary Fielding, Joseph F.'s mother, grew up on a country estate in Bedfordshire, England. Her father, John Fielding, was a humble tenant farmer and part-time Methodist preacher. Mary's mother, Rachel, came from a refined and wealthy British family who knew the value of education. And so Mary matured in an environment of learning and faith.
the age of 33, Mary Fielding left her comfortable home in the Old World and crossed the Atlantic Ocean to start anew in the rugged and untamed wilds of America. Along with her brother and sister, Mary settled in Toronto, Canada, joining with the Society of Independent Methodists, whose leader was none other than John Taylor.
In the spring of 1836, Parley P. Pratt, serving a mission in Canada, brought the restored gospel to Toronto, changing the course of Mary Fielding's life forever. Early the next year, the Fieldings followed the counsel of their newfound prophet and gathered to Kirtland, Ohio. In joining with the saints there, Mary had the privilege of living the gospel alongside the prophet Joseph and his brother Hiram.
It was during this time in Kirtland that Joseph F.'s parents would be brought together through tragic circumstances. In October of 1837, while Hiram was serving a mission in Missouri, his wife, Jerusha, passed away just 11 days after giving birth. On her sickbed, Jerusha gathered her other children together to leave them with some final words.
Tell your father when he comes that the Lord has taken your mother home and has left you for him to take care of.
Hiram comes back from Missouri, and Jerusha has died. You can imagine the pain that he experienced. He wasn't there for her. He wasn't there at the end. He wasn't there to hear what she said. And not only that, but she's left all these little children. And Hiram has to take care of them. And it was so difficult to go forward. He had the experience of being the single parent. And I think Joseph saw the difficulty that Hiram was facing. And I think he looked around and he saw this wonderful convert from England. Her name was Mary Fielding, who was so capable. She was a school teacher and so kind and so generous. And he mentioned to Hiram that he ought to take a second look at Mary Fielding. And so he did. And that brought together this second mother that came into that family.
The day before Christmas in 1837, Hiram and Mary were wed in a quiet ceremony in Kirtland. In the spring of 1838, under the cloud of mob violence, Hiram and Mary left Kirtland. They gathered with the saints in far west Missouri, where Joseph F. would be born later that year. It was here, on the first day of November, that Hiram was illegally taken captive along with his brother Joseph and locked in the cold, dark dungeon known as Liberty Jail. At the age of 37, Mary Fielding now found herself alone with 5 small children to care for, and another soon on the way.
Born on November 13, 1838, Joseph F. Smith entered the harsh world of an early saint, with his father held wrongfully in a distant jail, and his mother near death with a fever on the western frontier. From the first days of his infancy, Joseph F. was acquainted with suffering and persecution. When Joseph F. was only a few months old, the infamous mobber and anti-Mormon Reverend Samuel Bogart raided the cabin in which the baby boy was sleeping. Later in life, Joseph F. related what happened.
I, being an infant and lying on the bed, was entirely overlooked by the family during the fright and excitement. So, when the mob entered the room where I was, one bed was thrown onto the other, completely smothering me up. And here I was permitted to remain until after the excitement subsided. When thought of and discovered, my existence was supposed to have come to an end. But subsequent events have proved their suppositions erroneous, however well-founded.
While the infant Joseph F. was acquainted early on with the dangers of hatred and persecution, he was also exposed to the marvelous power of the priesthood of God. While his father Hiram was still imprisoned, baby Joseph F. and his mother visited him in Liberty Jail. There, Hiram took his youngest son, a future prophet of the Lord, and gave him a blessing. From his earliest days on earth, the life of Joseph F. Smith was directed from on high.
Later that winter, as mob harassment continued, Mary took baby Joseph F. and the other children across the Mississippi River to the safety of Illinois. After Hiram's escape from Liberty Jail, the family was finally united again in Nauvoo. In a letter to her brother serving a mission in England, Mary wrote of this happy time.
It is now little more than a month since the Lord, in his marvelous power, returned my dear husband in tolerable health. We are now living on the banks of the Mississippi River. This situation is very pleasant. How long we may be permitted to enjoy it, I know not, but the Lord knows what is best for us.
There we go.
In this same letter, Mary displayed the dedication, commitment, and faith that are demanded by one rearing a future prophet of God.
I feel but little concern about where I am, if I can keep my mind stayed upon God, for in this there is perfect peace. Oh, my dear brother, I think you would be pleased to see our little ones. Will you pray for us, that we may have the grace to train them up in the way they should go, so that they may be a blessing to us and the world? While Joseph had only 5 short years with his father, their time together in Nauvoo left impressions that stayed with him throughout his life. During these precious few years, Hiram was able to pass on, through example as well as instruction, the importance of hard work, integrity, and honesty to his young son. One such influential experience came while Hiram was responsible for the funds collected to build the Nauvoo Temple. Young Joseph took some of the temple money from inside his father's desk and went outside with it jingling in his pocket. A neighbor, seeing the boy's actions, took him straight back to his mother.
What do you have there? I saw you got that tight.
Never, said he, would he forget the fright that was given him when he was told that he was a thief.
Let's just march right up here. We're going to talk to your mother. Mrs. Smith, this is what your son's doing.
And young though he was, Joseph F. had the rare opportunity to sit in the presence of the prophet of the Restoration, and no doubt witnessed manifestations of the Spirit experienced by few others in this, the final dispensation.
Joseph F. Smith was very lucky, I mean, in the sense privileged, blessed, as it were, because as a young man living in Nauvoo, he really witnessed the expansion of the kingdom. He saw the first immigrants coming from England, from that great missionary work that began there. He also saw the temple built in Nauvoo. He was there when the cornerstones were laid. He witnessed all the great events. And also, he was able to hear the prophet in private settings and in public settings. He really was the last president of the church who was intimately acquainted with the prophet Joseph Smith, who heard teachings and instructions from the prophet Joseph Smith.
But these peaceful, spiritual years would draw quickly to an end. On the fateful day of June 27, 1844, Hiram Smith and the prophet Joseph, while held in the Carthage jail, were brutally murdered by a faceless, vicious mob. While he was only a boy of 5 when the murders took place, Joseph F. remembered well the events surrounding the loss of his dear father. On a trip to Nauvoo in 1906, as he walked the streets with friends, President Joseph F. Smith spoke at that time.
This is the exact spot where I stood when the brethren came riding up on their way to Carthage. Without getting off his horse, Father leaned over in his saddle and picked me up off the ground. He kissed me goodbye and put me down again. And I saw him ride away.
Young Joseph F. never saw his father alive again.
Of course, growing up without a father immediately changed Joseph's life, because now he literally had to become the man of the household. Mother was resolute, but nevertheless needed that extra help. And he showed in several ways that sense, that obligation, that loyalty to his mother, trying to fill the place of his father.
In the fall of 1846, still feeling ill-prepared, Mary Fielding Smith instructed her family to load their wagons with whatever they could, as mobs were beginning to terrorize the once beautiful city on the river. They moved hastily to the flatboats that would carry them across the Mississippi, where the body of the saints had already set up camp on the west bank. Joseph F.'s younger sister, Martha Ann, wrote of this rushed and painful exodus.
I was 5 years old when we started from Nauvoo. We crossed over the Mississippi on the skiff in the dusk of the evening. We left our home just as it was, our furniture and the fruit trees hanging full of rosy-cheeked peaches. We bid goodbye to the loved home that reminded us of our beloved father everywhere we turned.
In the coming days, Joseph F.'s mother made her way south to Keokuk, Iowa, and acquired the necessary teams and supplies to transport her clan to winter quarters.
One meaningful growth experience for Joseph F. occurred when the boy traveled down the Missouri River with his mother and Uncle Joseph Fielding to buy supplies.
The oxen are missing.
While camped along the riverbank, they arose one morning to find their oxen had disappeared in the night.
Well, have you looked down in this area? Maybe down by those willows.
Joseph, let's go take a look.
I'll fix breakfast while you look.
Don't know where them oxen are, but we sure need to find them soon. Tom, Joe, where are you?
After unsuccessfully searching the countryside for several hours with his uncle, Joseph F. returned to the camp, tired and discouraged.
As I approached, I saw my mother kneeling down in prayer. I halted for a moment and then drew gently near enough to hear her pleading with the Lord not to suffer us to be left in this helpless condition, but to lead us to recover our lost team. When she arose from her knees, the first expression I caught upon her precious face was a lovely smile, which, discouraged as I was, gave me renewed hope and an assurance I had not felt before.
Joseph F.'s faithful mother then walked deliberately to the nearby riverbank and discovered the missing animals hidden in a deep gulch. His mother's humble prayer and true act of faith were life lessons he would carry always in his heart.
It was one of the first practical and positive demonstrations of the efficacy of prayer I had ever witnessed. It made an indelible impression upon my mind and has been a source of comfort, assurance, and guidance to me throughout all my life.
By the end of that spring, Widow Smith and her caravan, consisting of 9 wagons, finally felt themselves ready to make the arduous journey over the Rocky Mountains. They were assigned to the 3rd 10 of the 4th Company under the direction of Captain Cornelius P. Lott and departed winter quarters on June 4th, 1848. At the age of 9, Joseph F. now found himself driving a team of oxen, pulling not just one, but 2 wagons. Many of their finest livestock had been lost in the harsh winter, and it was not until halfway to Elkhorn that they were able to get more animals. Upon reaching a hill, Joseph would have to unyoke the oxen and drive each wagon up separately. Needless to say, this first leg of the westward trek was tedious and tiresome.
Much of their company had already journeyed some distance to Elkhorn. Captain Lott, frustrated by Mary Smith's late departure and slow traveling, insisted that she and her group return to winter quarters to make better preparations and make the trip the next year. In an insulting manner, before her own family, he claimed that she would be a burden to the company, and he would have to carry her the whole way. But Joseph F. watched as his mother stood her ground and vowed to this belligerent captain that she would beat him into the Great Salt Lake Valley, which, to her great credit, she did.
I doubt that very much, lady.
Though harassed and hassled by her own captain the entire journey, Mary Fielding Smith led her family diligently and faithfully across thousands of miles of prairies and rugged mountains. And on the morning of September 23rd, 1848, the company arose and prepared to travel the last few miles into their land of promise.
Well, here was the wagon train, and they were right on the brink of coming into the valley. And I'm sure in the back of Captain Lott's mind, he still remembered the promise that Mary Fielding made to him that she would beat him to the valley. And so they get up in the morning, and all of a sudden her oxen are missing. Everybody else's are there, but hers are gone. And so they get everything organized, and they prepare to take off and leave her there without her team ready to go. And all of a sudden, across the sky comes this horrible storm that spooked all of the animals. So they had to take all the animals off of their harnesses and let them loose so that they wouldn't run off wild with the wagons. Mary Fielding, in the meantime, had found her animals. She hooked up her wagon, and she got in the wagon and got ready to go, and her brother said, "Don't you think we should wait for the others?" And I think she probably smiled and looked at him and said they weren't going to wait for us. And so they went down through the canyon and into the valley, and they were here. The wagon train didn't make it till the next day because of the storm they got caught in.
Along the trail, Joseph developed a great love for the oxen that helped bring his family across the country. At a celebration held in Ogden, Utah, on July 24th, 1917, President Smith spoke of his journey across the plains and the animals that made it possible.
My team consisted of 2 pairs of oxen. My leaders' names were Tom and Joe. We raised them from calves. My wheel team were named Broad and Barry. Many times, while traveling sandy or rough roads, long, thirsty drives, my oxen lowing with the heat and fatigue, I would put my arms around Tom's neck and cry bitter tears. That was all I could do. Tom was my best and most willing and obedient servant and friend.
Arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, however, did not signal lazy days for Joseph F. and his family. From 1848 to 1852, Joseph F. returned to his faithful duty of tending the family's herd.
In the fall of 1852, another tragedy occurred in the life of young Joseph F. On September 21st, just 2 months prior to his 14th birthday, his sweet, faithful mother passed away. Mary Fielding Smith, however, had taught her firstborn son, Joseph F., well. And though he was now an orphan, he was not bitter. Joseph Fielding Smith best describes his father's emotional state concerning this great loss in what was essentially the final chapter of his youth.
He had seen her devotion, her faithfulness to the church. he knew that she had endeavored to instruct her children in paths of righteousness. There was no bitterness in his soul when thinking of his mother's departure from this life. But there filled his bosom a strong determination that, come what may, he would live as she taught him to live.
I think another insight from his young life that will help us to understand is an incident that happened in Salt Lake City. Apparently, in a one schoolroom setting, his sister was going to be punished, and he felt unjustly. And the teacher was going to apparently whip her. And Joseph F. Smith just couldn't allow his sister to suffer this indignation, especially when it wasn't deserved. Stood up to the teacher and said, "It's not going to happen." And they literally came to fisticuffs. And apparently, Joseph F. Smith beat the teacher up and was immediately dismissed from school. And this, of course, story tells us, one, about a young boy who's becoming a prophet, learning about human relationships, learning how to control his temper, but also revealing to us this incredible sense of loyalty. Dismissed from school, what do you do with a teenage boy? The prophet, Brigham Young, decides that Joseph F. Smith is time to begin his ministry.
18 months after the death of his mother, Joseph F. attended the 1854 April General Conference. The lad was stunned as President Brigham Young rose to the pulpit and read the name of Joseph F. Smith as one who would be leaving on a mission to the Pacific Isles. Although only 15 years of age and denied both the family and the finances to support himself, Joseph willingly accepted this call from the Lord.
On April 24th, Joseph's cousin, George A. Smith, set him apart as an elder in the church. Later that day, he received his endowments and was then set apart for his mission by Elder Parley P. Pratt. And on May 27th, 1854, 21 missionaries left for California.
Arriving in San Bernardino on the 9th of June, the missionaries looked for work in order to pay for the continued journey to the Pacific. After spending the summer making shingles or working as a farmhand, Joseph F. Smith had finally saved enough money for the ticket to Hawaii. On the 8th of September, 1854, Elder Smith and 8 other missionaries set sail on the clipper ship Vaquero. The journey, wrought with rough seas and foul sailors, took nearly 3 weeks and was one which all the elders were overjoyed to have behind them.
Joseph F. was assigned to labor on the island of Maui. Shortly after his arrival, he wrote a letter home to George A. Smith, in which he spoke of the Hawaiians and his love for the work.
This people are very kind and generous-hearted, and will do anything they can to assist us to learn the language and to make us comfortable. I know that the work in which I am engaged is the work of the living and true God, and I am ready to bear my testimony of the same at any time or at any place or in whatsoever circumstances I may be placed.
Although Joseph was a faithful, hard-working missionary, his young age and difficult childhood often conspired to discourage him. It was during these early months, as a 15-year-old elder, that Joseph F. had a dream which bestowed upon him the self-confidence he exhibited the rest of his life.
When Joseph F. was on his mission in Hawaii, he had a very significant dream that changed his entire life. He dreamed he was on a journey, and he felt strongly impressed that he had to hurry with all of his might because he had to fear that he might arrive too late. He was only carrying with him a small bundle wrapped in a handkerchief. As he journeyed on, he saw a sign, and it simply said, "Bath." He entered in. He washed himself clean. He opened his bundle and found therein a beautiful, clean set of white garments. He put them on, and then he immediately went and knocked on the door of the mansion. The door was opened by the prophet Joseph Smith himself, and he said, "Joseph, you are late." Joseph simply responded with a, "Yes, but I'm clean. I am clean.
Later in life, Joseph F. spoke about the impact this dream had on him.
When I awoke that morning, I was a man, although only a boy. There was not anything in the world that I feared. I could meet any man or woman or child and look them in the face, feeling in my soul that I was a man every whit. That vision has made me what I am. If I am anything that is good, clean, or upright before the Lord, or if there is anything good in me.
While some missionaries believed their calling was to teach the white settlers and avoid the islanders, whom they felt were below their dignity as messengers of the gospel, young Joseph F. Smith recognized immediately the kindness of their hearts and their willingness to learn. So much was Elder Smith blessed with the spirit of the word and the gift of tongues that after only a few months in the islands, he was, for all intents and purposes, fluent in the language.
Joseph F. was often called upon to travel the various islands, to teach, baptize, heal, and encourage the natives in their own tongue.
Joseph F. Smith loved the Hawaiian people. He came here as a missionary when he was 15 years old. By age 16, he was the branch president in a Maui branch, and many of his older companions looked at him in awe. They were amazed at his great ability at such a young age. But when he was 17, he was assigned to Molokai, and while he was there, he contracted a raging tropical fever. A woman who lived there, Manuhi'i, offered to take care of him. She made a kind of mattress out of lauhala mats near the ocean under a kamani tree, and she carried this 17-year-old, gangly young man out and placed him on those mats. She would come by frequently throughout the day to give him a little water and to take his temperature. She cared for him for over 3 months as he lingered in a near-death condition.
Perhaps due to the early loss of his own mother, Joseph never forgot the kindness extended to him by this loving and giving woman. More than 50 years later, Joseph F. returned to the islands, this time as president of the church. Bishop Charles Nibley, who accompanied President Smith on that later journey, recorded what happened.
The native saints were out in great numbers with their wreaths or leis. It was a beautiful sight to see, the deep-seated love that these people had for him. In the midst of it all, I noticed a poor old blind woman tottering under the weight of about 90 years being led in. She was calling, "Yosepa! Yosepa!" When he saw her, he ran to her and clasped her in his arms, hugged her and kissed her over and over again, saying, "Mama, Mama, my dear old Mama." And with tears streaming down his cheeks, he turned to me and said, "Charlie, she nursed me when I was a boy, sick and without anyone to care for me. She took me in and was a mother to me."
Unfortunately, many of Joseph's mission experiences were lost when a fire consumed the building where the elders stored their trunks. The only thing that survived was Joseph's missionary certificate, although it was slightly burned around the edges. Because of the fire, for a little while, Joseph and his companion had only one suit between them. One would go to meetings while the other stayed in bed. Then they would switch, and the one who went to meetings would stay in bed while the other one went out.
We never tire in well-doing. It is true we get leg-weary a little sometimes, but in the most adverse circumstances, when the clouds of oppression darken and frown upon us in the most frightful manner, Just one thought upon the glorious hope and faith we cherish dispels every cloud and makes all thoughts of fatigue and weariness vanish like the morning dew before a cloudless sun.
These were the words of a 17-year-old boy, all alone on a distant island, far from what remained of his family, and living among a people whose way of life was vastly different from anything he could ever have imagined. Clearly, this was a young man of whom great things were expected, and one of whom his parents, Hiram and Mary Fielding Smith, could be infinitely proud.
Joseph F. was in Hawaii, and he was tending to the Lord's work, but he didn't lose sight of his responsibility to take care of his family at home as well, and the family at that time was his younger sister, Martha Ann. And he said to her in one particular letter, which was really touching, "Tend to the ducks and to the books. But if you don't have time to do both, then set the ducks aside and spend your time with the books."
For over 3 years, Elder Joseph F. Smith loved, taught, and converted the native Hawaiians spread across the islands. Despite his youth and worldly inexperience, he was looked to by missionaries and members alike as one with knowledge and wisdom. In the fall of 1857, word was received that Brigham Young was releasing all the missionaries sent out in Joseph's group.
The valley of the Great Salt Lake was not the same when Joseph returned. Throughout the previous year, various anti-Mormons who had found their way into territorial government had been falsely accusing Brigham Young of all sorts of criminal acts against non-LDS citizens of the area. They filed numerous affidavits in Washington, D.C., and eventually persuaded the President of the United States to take action. President James Buchanan, without even investigating the outrageous charges, agreed to send troops to Utah to control the Mormons.
After reporting on his mission to Brigham Young, Joseph enlisted in the militia and helped prepare for what they felt, based on past experiences, was inevitable war. He assisted in evacuating the city and then patrolled its streets, prepared to set the homes and businesses on fire when given the order. Brigham Young was determined to leave nothing behind for their persecutors. Thankfully, President Buchanan learned of the falseness of the charges against the saints and granted, as only an unsympathetic politician can, a free and full pardon to the Mormon people.
Joseph now took it upon himself to help his relatives who had fled south return to their homes. One such relative was 16-year-old Levira Smith, who was very much impressed with the young, handsome returned missionary. Levira and Joseph F. took a liking to each other, and a courtship ensued. Joseph then set about trying to establish a home and a livelihood for himself. He was appointed Sergeant at Arms of the Territorial Legislature, and in March of 1858, at the ripe age of 20, was ordained a 70. A year later, on April 5th, 1859, Joseph and Levira were married.
It was not long thereafter that the newlyweds were provided an opportunity to show their faith and commitment to the cause of the gospel. At the General Conference of the church the next April, Joseph was once again called upon to serve a mission, this time, however, to the island of Great Britain. Within the month, Joseph and the other elders called during that conference left for Europe.
Not long after he arrived in England, Joseph was given responsibility over the missionary work throughout most of the country. And despite being but 22 years old, he was highly thought of by the members as well as his fellow missionaries.
Joseph also had a reputation for being a no-nonsense, toe-the-line type of leader. At a meeting in Leeds, he rebuked one of the local priesthood holders by announcing from the pulpit that those who had a habit of drinking liquor should please keep off the stand on the Sabbath when their breath smells. Shortly after the meeting, President Smith received a note from the chastised brother stating that he had burned his hymnal, all his other works, and that he would burn his Book of Mormon as soon as he could find it. with wisdom clearly beyond his years. Joseph responded with,
"Oh, when will men learn that in rejecting their own salvation, they themselves alone are the sufferers? What a wonderful influence the devil has over men when they once give way to the wickedness that is in them. That which yesterday was lovely and dear to them, today is hateful and obnoxious. Yet truth is the same forever. It is man that changes."
When Joseph F. was in England, he wrote a lot of letters to Martha Ann and told her about England and the people there and the things that were happening. And many of the people at that time were emigrating to the United States and then sending money back for their families to come. And some of the family members who went to America were not members of the church, and they weren't necessarily the best people that England had to offer. And Joseph noticed this, and he commented in one of his letters to Martha Ann about these people.
"They are the meanest specimens of humanity. Some could do no worse if they should send for his satanic majesty's lowest imps, and would be gainers by odds to send for Beelzebub himself."
On June 24th, 1863, after 3 years of honorable service and leadership in England, Joseph F. was released from his mission and returned home. When he arrived in Salt Lake, he found his young wife not at all the way he had left her. Her state of mind was described as being nervous and agitated. Joseph was required to spend the next 6 weeks, day and night, nursing and caring for her. Elvira seemed to recover under the love and care Joseph provided, and he was eventually able to focus his efforts on obtaining some financial security for himself and his wife.
For 6 months, Joseph worked at the various odd jobs he was able to find around Salt Lake City. However, in late February of 1864, a call to the home of President Brigham Young changed the young husband's plans once again. The call from the prophet was to return to the islands of Hawaii. After Joseph had been called home from his first mission to the Pacific, the new converts of the church had been deceived and led astray by a man named Walter Gibson.
One of the interesting and colorful personages that came in the sphere of Mormonism was Walter Murray Gibson, a political adventurer. He came to Salt Lake, visited with Brigham Young. He was interested in the Pacific Islands. He wanted the saints actually to gather there. But, of course, the Lord had told Brigham Young that the saints should gather in the Rocky Mountains. But missionary work would continue. So he sent Walter Gibson to the Hawaiian Islands to continue on the work. And when he got there, all of a sudden things started to change. He used his position as the leader of the missionary activity in the church in the Hawaiian Islands for self-aggrandizement. He started literally having people pay for priesthood ordinations and totally perverting the church, just like in the first century, how the apostasy occurred. Well, it occurred rapidly in Hawaii. And, of course, the saints there believed that he'd been sent by church authority, followed him. And eventually word came to Salt Lake that this had happened.
These were the conditions in the Pacific when President Young asked Joseph F. to accompany 2 apostles as they set in order the church in Hawaii. Again, Joseph put the will of the Lord before his own. Leaving Elvira in the care of her family, he departed within a few weeks with fellow Hawaiian missionaries Alma L. Smith and William Clough, and with the apostles Lorenzo Snow and Ezra T. Benson. On March 31st, a month after leaving Salt Lake City, the ship carrying these brethren dropped anchor about a mile offshore from the island of Maui.
When they had come to Maui, Joseph F. Smith knew the islands well. He knew the seashore well. There was a storm, and the leaders had decided to land. Joseph F. Smith, being the younger, the junior companion, as it were, felt uncomfortable. He knew that this wasn't a good time and forewarned the missionaries not to make the attempt. They said, no, we're going to do it. Joseph F. Smith, again, an insight to his loyalty. If you command me to do this by the power of the priesthood, I'll do it. But if you don't, I'm not going to go with you because I think it's a crazy idea. Of course, Joseph is left on board. The missionaries head towards land, and just as Joseph had told them, the boat was capsized, And poor Joseph F. Smith, wise beyond his age, watched helplessly from the ship as these poor missionaries struggled, and literally one of them drowned. It was Lorenzo Snow, and eventually was revived. After this incident, of course, Lorenzo Snow receives the insight that this young missionary, the junior companion, will someday become president of the church.
The elders were fortunate enough to arrive within a few days of a church conference which had been called by Walter Gibson. On the 6th of April, they attended the first meeting and were astonished to see the reverence and homage paid to Gibson by the congregation. He stood before them and claimed that these brethren from Utah were impostors and not to be believed. Because of Joseph F. Smith's gift with the language, he was called upon by Elder Benson to speak to the saints after Gibson had finished. Lorenzo Snow recorded the effect of Elder Smith's words upon the people.
It seemed impossible for any man to speak with greater power and demonstration of the Spirit. The spirit and power that accompanied Brother Smith's remarks astonished the saints and opened their eyes. They began to see how they had been imposed upon. Every word he spoke found a response in their hearts.
Shortly after the conclusion of the conference, Walter Gibson was excommunicated from the church. Lorenzo Snow and Ezra Benson then returned to Salt Lake, leaving Joseph in charge of rebuilding the church in Hawaii and strengthening the faith of the members. Within the year, the affairs of the mission were running well, and Elder Smith was called home to Utah.
When Joseph F. arrived in Salt Lake City on that December day in 1864, he concluded what was, with the exception of a few scattered months, nearly 10 straight years' service as a missionary for the church. At the age of 26, Joseph had under his belt a decade of service, leadership, and incomparable spiritual growth. Although Joseph F. himself was most likely unaware of the prophetic impressions received by Lorenzo Snow in Hawaii, anyone who followed the events in his life could not help but see the remarkable heights to which the son of the patriarch would one day be elevated.
He will reveal it to you.
Upon his return home, Joseph found employment in the historian's office of the church. Here, he was tutored and trained by his cousin George A. Smith, who was like a father to him and had been the church historian for the past 10 years. During this time, Joseph also served occasionally as a secretary to both the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles.
On the surface, Joseph's work in the historian's office and his intermittent secretarial work for the leaders of the church seem insignificant. However, events would soon unfold that connected these two activities with the future course of Joseph F.'s life.
In the spring of 1866, Brigham Young asked Joseph to enter into plural marriage. This was a strong test of both men and women. They grew up in a country which believed in monogamy. They had the expectation of what their life was going to be like. He loved his first wife. But again, showing his resolute determination to be faithful in every detail, he accepted. And in May of 1866, he's sealed to his second wife.
Less than 2 months after entering plural marriage, Joseph had his second life-changing experience of that year.
July 1st, 1866, Joseph F. Smith was acting as secretary in a meeting with Brigham Young and some of the apostles. At the conclusion of the meeting and the brethren were leaving, Brigham Young said, "Hold on, shall I do as I feel led?" And then he said, "I always do as I feel constrained by the Spirit. My mind tells me to ordain Joseph F. Smith to the apostleship and as one of my counselors." The brethren sustained him in that, and Joseph F. was immediately ordained, with Brigham Young being mouth. After the ordination, Brigham Young said, "It is wisdom that we do not reveal this ordination at this time."
It was not until the next year at the October General Conference that Joseph's ordination was announced to the body of the church. Here he was called into the Quorum of the 12 to replace Amasa M. Lyman, who had apostatized.
In the spring of 1868, the whirlwind that was Joseph F.'s life continued to turn in unexpected ways. His first wife, Elvira, troubled by her ill health and inability to bear children, obtained a legal separation from him and moved to California. Over the next 16 years, from March 1st, 1868 to January 13th, 1884, Joseph would enter into 4 more plural marriages: to Sarah Ellen Richards in 1868, Edna Lamson in 1871, Alice Ann Kimball in 1883, and finally Mary Taylor Schwartz in 1884. With these 5 women, Joseph would become the father of 48 children, children whom he referred to as the greatest of all earthly joys.
As Joseph's responsibilities continued to grow at home and in the church, so too did the persecutions heaped upon them by the outside world. The territory of Utah was struggling to become a state, but found it impossible as enemies nearby and congressmen in Washington continually threw obstacles in their path. Their main object of contention was polygamy.
During this intense period of persecution and prosecution during the 1880s, the church literally came to a point where the government tried to destroy it. The Latter Saints believed it was a commandment of God. They believed that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. They believed that the Constitution protected their rights to worship how they saw fit. The government saw otherwise. So the church leaders decided to go on the underground, simply to disappear to avoid arrest. As a result of John Taylor's decision to do this, Joseph F. Smith also decides to leave. This gave the church incredible opportunities for leaders to go on missions, but also, again, the impact on Joseph F. Smith's family life. Showing his loyalty, showing his commitment, no matter what the circumstance was. Joseph F. Smith does not renounce plural marriage, stays faithful to the principle, stays faithful to the counsel of the President Church, and leaves his family again.
For Joseph F. Smith, showing a willingness to sacrifice all for the kingdom of God was nothing new. One such test came while he was still a teenager, traveling home from his mission to Hawaii.
His small group of travelers had stopped near a ranch for breakfast when a band of drunken horsemen came upon their camp. The men were cursing and swearing to murder any Mormons they came across. Elder Smith's companions had seen the men coming and hid themselves, but Joseph, who had been gathering wood, returned just as one of the mobbers approached. Confronting him, "Are you a blankety-blank Mormon?" the man yelled at the young boy. And true to his faith, Joseph F. declared, "Yes, sirree, dyed in the wool, true blue, through and through." Taken completely by surprise, the man extended his hand and said, "Well, you are the blankety-blank pleasantest man I ever met. I'm glad to see a fellow stand up for his convictions." It was because of his convictions that Joseph spent many years in hiding and serving the church in distant lands.
From September 1884 to September 1891, Joseph F. Smith was in exile. To keep him from the hands of his enemies, he was sent on many trips among the various stakes of the church. And when he was not on the road, he was hiding at retreats he codenamed Solitude Gloria and Serene Plentiful. While in hiding, Joseph wrote the following:
I often feel wrathy, and perhaps never more so than now. But I will not express my wrath, or it would be inadequate to the occasion. I rely upon the promise that God has made. Vengeance is mine, and I will repay. Retribution will come upon the heads of the whole nation. I cannot conceive of anything more contemptible than to blast the peace and break up the sacred relations of husbands and wives, parents and children. I am satisfied that God's punishment will be just, so I will wait.
In the winter of 1885, Joseph F. returned to Hawaii for his third mission on the islands. He took Jelino with him, but the rest of his family was forced to suffer alone the torments of government agents and deputies.
The intensity of persecution at the time that the government was forcing raids on the Mormon people, at the time that plural marriage had risen to such a crescendo in terms of the fight back and forth. Joseph F. Smith was forced to leave here. There were constant persecutions, threats of being thrown in jail. Other apostles at that time had been thrown in jail. And Joseph F. was put in this very precarious situation, so he left and went to Hawaii again. But you can imagine how hard that was for him to leave his family, recognizing that they would still face some of the persecution, that there may still be some of those late-night raids. It was so painful for him, and he would write about it.
O God, may this month see thy people relieved from this oppression and persecutions of their enemies in Zion. May all be well with my family, and all the families of thy persecuted servants this morning, and henceforth, and forever.
Sometimes we think that because conditions were difficult in those pioneer years, that people expected to lose children, they expected life to be hard, they expected a lot of setbacks, a lot of trials and disappointments, and indeed they had them. In fact, for Joseph F. Smith, every time anything like that happened, it was hard. When his little daughter died and he was away, it was hard. When he was home and another child died and he had walked the floor with this sick child night after night, it was so painful for him. And he would write about it. The tenderness in his heart for the people that were close to him came out as he described what it was like to lose someone that was so close to him. In a letter that he wrote home to his sister, he described the hot summer day that he was experiencing and the loss, again, of another member of his family. And it took him back to remembering the hot summer day when he lost his father and the day when he lost his mother. I think those memories were forever etched in his mind, and I think the feeling and the pain was there as well.
While Joseph was soon able to return from Hawaii to Utah, he was still unable to go home to his family or to attend the conferences of the church. Often, he was forced to tuck his long beard under his collar or use some other disguise in order to move around town.
Near the end of September 1890, President Woodruff issued what has become known as the Manifesto. This declaration essentially ended the practice of plural marriage and paved the way for a truce between the government of the United States and the leadership of the church.
However, it was not until a year later, September 10, 1891, that Joseph F. Smith was able to move freely among his friends and family. On that day, President Benjamin Harrison finally signed the papers granting Joseph amnesty from prosecution. Later that month, Joseph addressed a congregation in the tabernacle, something he had been unable to do for the past 7 years. He recorded his feelings on the event.
The house was full to the gallery. I spoke briefly, for I was so overcome by my feelings that I could scarcely restrain them. This is a memorable day for me, and no words at my command can express my gratitude to God.
Joseph F. Smith had obeyed a commandment from God, and for this, the world had persecuted him, just as they had his father and uncle before him. But like his noble ancestry, Joseph F. was laying up treasures in heaven, and no amount of ridicule or hatred would keep him from completing the work or receiving the blessings which the Lord had in store for him.
During the years that Joseph F. and the church were wrestling with the country over polygamy, Joseph was also attending to his duties as a newly called apostle. In 1873, while not yet 35 years old, Joseph was preparing for his 4th mission, this time to preside over the work in all of Europe. He was again called upon to leave his family behind. But for Joseph, no sacrifice was too great. At the October conference before his departure, he spoke to the saints.
Let us do our duty and be for God and his kingdom. Let our motto be, the kingdom of God or nothing. Because in the kingdom there is everything, and outside of it, nothing at all.
Over the next several years, Joseph was twice sent to England, only to return home prematurely under unhappy circumstances. The first was the death of his close friend and surrogate father, George A. Smith. The second time was in 1877, after the death of President Brigham Young.
After returning to Salt Lake, Joseph again took up his duties in the historian's office and also in the endowment house, where he was now in charge.
In the fall of 1880, the Quorum of the 12 felt it was time to again organize a first presidency, and John Taylor, the presiding apostle, was unanimously sustained as the prophet and president of the church. As his counselors, he chose George Q. Cannon and the 42-year-old veteran of 4 missions and numerous responsibilities, Joseph F. Smith.
Because a large part of Joseph's tenure in the first presidency was conducted in exile, he was unable to speak at conferences or meet often with the saints. However, he wrote many letters to his family and friends wherein he provided apostolic wisdom. One such letter was to his nephew, Albert J. David.
I want you to listen to my counsel, and I will guarantee you prosperity and honor. Love and trust in God. Be generous and forgiving, even to your enemies. Make no promises you cannot keep. And when you make a promise, keep it. Observe these few things with all else of good, and you will be loved of God and honored of men.
It was this faith in the gospel and willful submission to the hand of the Lord that made Joseph a logical choice to continue in the first presidency after the passing of John Taylor in 1887. And not surprisingly, in September of 1898, 11 days after Wilford Woodruff was called home to his Heavenly Father, newly sustained President Lorenzo Snow also chose Joseph as one of his counselors. By this time, Joseph's experience in the leadership of the church was unparalleled. It was this experience and his faithful devotion to the gospel that prompted President Snow to offer this compliment to Joseph.
I depend upon you to help me. You understand things, and I need your help. You are not afraid to speak your mind before anyone. Therefore, you are a helpful counselor, and I rely upon your integrity and your judgment.
When President Snow assumed his role at its head, the church and most of the members were deeply in debt. As the first presidency sought direction from the Lord, they also encouraged faith among their followers. At the April conference after the organization of the new presidency, Joseph offered hope to the discouraged saints.
The clouds may gather over our heads, and as in the past, it may seem impossible for us to penetrate them. Yet there can be no cloud so dark, so gloomy, or so heavy, but God will roll them away in his own time, and will bring good out of threatening evil. He has done it in the past. He will do it in the future. For it is his work, not the work of man.
The 1890s were a difficult period for the church. I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the federal government's vigorous prosecution of the church corporately, but also individual members of the church were being sought, arrested, tried, and imprisoned, and church property was being confiscated. As a result, many members of the church said, why donate to the church if simply the government's going to take it away? So when Lorenzo Snow makes his famous trip to St. George, he has this feeling that it's time for a reformation. And there he had this inspiration, this promise. He said, if the saints will redouble their efforts and pay tithing, live the law of tithing as outlined in the Revelations, the Lord would bless the people.
As President Snow's counselor, Joseph F. was deeply involved in this admonition to the saints to pay their tithing. In April 1899, he spoke to them on the subject of heavenly record keeping.
And also a genealogy.
We do not keep an account of that which you should pay. We simply keep an account of that which you do pay. But there is one above us who knows. And there may be a system of keeping accounts there wherein it will be known just what every man should pay to be honest with himself and the Lord.
This crusade, under the leadership of President Snow, resulted in an influx of tithing dollars and an eventual return to financial stability for the church. It was also during this time that questions were raised as to the seniority of the 12 apostles. A rule of succession in the presidency had been established, and now the question of who was sustained when was of utmost importance to the future of the church.
In October 1898, Lorenzo Snow was president of the church, with George Q. Cannon as the first counselor and Joseph F. Smith as the second counselor. Franklin D. Richards was the president of the 12, with Brigham Young Jr. as the second member of the 12. Then, December 1899, Franklin D. Richards died, and this raised a question: was seniority based on ordination to the office of apostle, or when a person became a member of the quorum of the 12 apostles? In March of 1900, the first presidency of the 12 meet, and this becomes a very important meeting because the question arises, who actually is senior? And at that meeting, Lorenzo Snow, as president of the church, says that if he died, George Q. Cannon would be the next because he became a member of the 12 in 1860. And that if George Q. Cannon died, then Joseph F. Smith would be the next successor because he became a member of the 12 in 1867, previous to Brigham Young Jr., even though he'd been ordained earlier.
On April 12, 1901, President George Q. Cannon passed away, leaving Joseph F. as the only counselor in the first presidency until the October conference. Then, on October 10th, just 4 days after selecting a new counselor, President Lorenzo Snow passed away in his bed. There seems little question in the minds of faithful Latter-day Saints that the Lord directs his church, and that he will place at its head the man whom he sees fit to be there. And while Joseph F. Smith certainly never aspired to the presidency or its weighty mantle of responsibility, the events of his life and the hand of the Almighty had prepared and molded him as a man fit for the calling.
In October of 1901, just 1 week after the death of President Lorenzo Snow, the apostles gathered in the Salt Lake Temple and unanimously voted for and set apart the senior apostle, Joseph F. Smith, as the 6th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Joseph F. Smith has a remarkable heritage. He really is unique in the church in that he reaches back right to the center of the church in terms of coming from a father, Hiram Smith, who stood by the side of Joseph Smith. His father had been the patriarch of the church. Through that line came other patriarchs of the church. And so you have this remarkable tie. And he felt that all his life. Though he lost his father when he was a young boy, I think that the influence of his father was never lost on him.
Maybe more than any other church leader up to that time, Joseph F. Smith had been prepared to become the president of the church. He's the first church president to be born of LDS parents. He experienced the incredible growth of Nauvoo. He heard the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. His numerous missions manifested in several ways his loyalty to the kingdom. By the time he became president of the church in 1901, he'd already been an apostle since 1866. He served as a counselor to Brigham Young. He served as a counselor to John Taylor, to Wilford Woodruff, and to Lorenzo Snow.
Prepared as he was, however, Joseph F. Smith had no greater strength than his personal testimony, which burned deep in his heart since the early days of his youth. In the April General Conference of 1901, just months before he was called as president of the church, Joseph F. once again bore his powerful testimony of the restored gospel.
I have received an assurance which has taken possession of my whole being. It has sunk deep into my heart. It fills every fiber of my soul, so that I feel to say before this people, that God has revealed unto me that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that Joseph Smith is, was, and always will be a prophet of God. I know as I live that this is true, and I bear testimony to its truth.
As Joseph F. took over his administration, the church finally began to stabilize and was completely out of debt by 1907.
When Joseph F. Smith became president of the church headquarters was basically the old Brigham Young property, the president's home, the Beehive House, the president's office. And it looked like a frontier community. I mean, this is what the church headquarters has been since the 1850s. And so it's during Joseph F. Smith's administration that a great building program commences. We have the Hotel Utah, the Deseret Gym, new buildings at the LDS Academy, the LDS University there in Salt Lake City, a bishop's building, and most importantly, the new church administrative office that is now located at 47 East South Temple. When this is completed and dedicated in 1917, it's the first time in church history that the entire First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 have offices together. Additionally, during his presidency, some important programs were announced and advanced. And maybe at the time, people might have thought, do we really need this? Of course, he is the one who inaugurates the Family Home Evening program. The church becomes the first organized religion in America to affiliate with the Boy Scouts of America. The seminary program starts at Granite Seminary. So a lot of programs that were interesting. They were obviously novel. Now, today, we look back and see them as absolutely being an essential part of our church. And so it's the vision of Joseph F. Smith to take the gospel to the world.
Another important development in the church under the leadership of President Smith was the acquiring of church historical sites.
In December of 1905, 100 years after the birth of the prophet Joseph, President Smith traveled to Vermont for the unveiling of a monument in honor of his uncle.
The thought that here in this land was where my kindred had birth, that we are perhaps traversing the same roads and the same ravines, my heart is like that of a child. I suppose perhaps it is due to the fact that my early remembrances were painful and sorrowful. I want to live so that I will be worthy in some degree of the love and confidence shown toward me.
I think the photograph of Joseph F. Smith with his family, with his children, tells us a lot. Here's a man who lost his father, lost his mother. That sense of loss, that sense of wanting to be part of a family unit caused Joseph F. Smith to reach out to his children, to really be an incredible father, to be an incredible husband, loving, concerned. His letters, his diaries tell us about this love for his family. And I think it goes back to the fact that here's a young man who experienced loss in his own life and wanted his own children to experience the beautiful home life that the gospel really teaches us about.
As the president, Joseph F. Smith felt a tremendous love and responsibility for the saints scattered around the world. He traveled much throughout the country and also in Europe, visiting the missions, dedicating chapels, and strengthening members.
Joseph F. Smith went to Rotterdam, and you can imagine the excitement of the saints, small little cadre of saints as they were. And there was a young man, his name was John, who was impaired significantly. He'd had some problems with his eyes. He couldn't see. They were bandaged. But he really believed that if he could just be near Joseph F. Smith, if he could be in his presence, that he would be healed. And so he was taken to the event, and Joseph F. Smith was there, and I think made aware that this young man had this great desire. So Joseph F. Smith went over to this young boy, John, and he lifted his bandage, and he looked into his eyes, and then covered them back again with the bandage. Well, you'd like to say that at that moment he could see then. Well, he couldn't, but he went home, and they took the bandages off, and he could see. The remarkable part about that story, I think, is that he was healed by a prophet of God, but he had the faith to be healed. He had the faith in a prophet of God. I think he saw Joseph F. Smith for what he was.
Certainly miracles followed this prophet throughout his life, but none was greater or more significant than the glorious vision he was given just shortly before he would be called home from this mortal world. In October of 1918, as 79-year-old Joseph rested in his home, tired and worn from a life of never-ending service, he found himself closer than ever to the Spirit, and the veil seemed to grow very thin.
I will not, I dare not, attempt to enter upon many things that are resting upon my mind this morning. I have not lived alone these 5 months. I have dwelt in the spirit of prayer, of supplication, of faith, and of determination. And I've had many communications with the Spirit of the Lord.
The very day before this address was given to the church, President Smith had in reality received a sacred and significant revelation concerning the Lord's visit to the spirit world.
This is a revelation that was received by President Joseph F. Smith on the 4th of October in the year 1918. Earlier that year, one of his sons, Hiram Max Smith, had passed away. In that setting where he's lost a son, where he anticipates his own death, where he's had the experience over the years to lose a number of children, he ponders this matter of what takes place in the world of the spirits. And more particularly, as he read in 1 Peter, about how Christ visited the world of the spirits and preached to the spirits there, just how the gospel was taught. And so as he reads those scriptures, he says, I pondered over these things which are written, and the eyes of my understanding were opened, and the Spirit of the Lord rested upon me, and I saw the host of the dead, both small and great. And this then constituted the beginning of this marvelous panoramic vision that he sees of the world of the spirits.
Joseph F. Smith is literally on his deathbed in 1918 in the Beehive House when he has this great vision of the redemption of the dead. He rallies his spirits and comes to conference, and people are absolutely amazed. Diaries tell us they're just shocked that he's there. And during that presentation, he tells he's been in the spirit with this great vision he had just before conference. He records this with his son, Joseph Fielding Smith, taking the notes, and finally it's in written form and presented to the First Presidency of the Quorum of the 12 and the Patriarch of the Church. And in their meeting, their deliberation at the end of October, they vote that this is a revelation from God.
Just a few weeks after this wonderful event, on November 19th, 1918, President Joseph F. Smith was taken from the world in which his duty was done so very well. The impoverished pioneer boy, so young orphaned, had overcome every trial set in his path and proved his testimony of Jesus Christ to be far more than words. It was, in very fact, his duty. And as this prophet of God returned from whence he came, finally meeting again his martyred father and beloved mother, there is no doubt that as he passed through the veil to greet the world beyond, he was able to say, I am clean. I am clean.